Afternoon, evening, whatever time you're tuning in the program called What's Going On FlintTalkRadio.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program, and as I look around here for the cameras that are on after being away for a while, I think all of the listeners out there know I was in Africa for the last 3 weeks, and when I came back to the United States, where in Africa it had been very warm, and I prepared for very cold weather, didn't know exactly what to expect over there. And I went over there with all these long sleeve shirts and a heavy overcoat, and I ran into really nice weather. When I came back here, though, it was a different story in terms of my flight having to be rerouted from Belgium to, originally was scheduled to go to Dulles and Washington, and then we rerouted from Belgium to Chicago and got stuck in Chicago, and then went to Cleveland, which would have bypassed Flint and had to come back this way, and got to Cleveland and had to stay there for a number of hours because we were stranded in Cleveland because of the weather, and finally got to Flint, the home base, one day late. Should have arrived in Flint on Sunday night, didn't arrive until Monday evening. But we're back here now at the studio, and we'll be doing our program as always at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And we are delighted, as always, to have you aboard. And want you to stay tuned to all the programs here at FlintTalkRadio.com. Not all of us take vacations away from the studio and go to Africa for 3 weeks. Most persons are more dedicated than that. I hate to say that I lost my dedication to an extent while I was gone, because I should have been here with the viewers of our program, and, of course, with those who are here working very hard to continue to earn your support and to deserve your respect, what we do here at the studio. And we hope you will continue to support what we do here, and we are getting ready to expand in some areas that we have not yet gone into, including possible newspaper, and we're going to see how this ends up. We have a lot of things in our mind to do and want to make a greater contribution in our community and also around the nation, and we'll see how it plays out. But we have some things on the drawing board we want you to be aware of, and as we begin to put final touches on it, we're going to spring forth what we're doing here, let you know what's going on, not only on the program, but what's going on throughout the studio, and we hope you will join us in those efforts as well. Today, we're coming to you to talk about my experiences in Africa, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Mandela, who was, as you know, buried 9 days after his demise from among us, and they had the burial after some time with Mandela laying in state to be paid his due respect at the end of his journey, having left us at the age of 95. And we'll talk about that before the program is over. We'll also just share a few things about what was going on in the African landscape where I was for the past 3 weeks. I went to Africa. I think I left out of here on the 16th of November, and I arrived back Monday evening, too late to do the program, so we're back at the studio today, but we came back last Monday, but too late to do the show at that time. And being in Africa for the 3 weeks, it really gives you another perspective of what was going on in South Africa and other parts of Africa as well. And when Mandela died, I was able to go around to 3 different countries. I was started out with Gambia, and I went from there to Senegal. Then I went to the Cameroons, where I was right next door to the civil war that's going on right now in the Central African Republic. And I wanted to get close so I could be in touch with the news reports coming out of the country that is now troubled after the overthrow of President Bozizé, who was overthrown in March of this year in the Central African Republic. And they're now going through a traumatic experience where many people have been run out of their homes, and some 400,000 persons have been displaced. And although there was a certain amount of sectarian unity to get Bozizé out of power, after that was accomplished, then the factionalism basically around religious differences in the Central African Republic began to come to the surface, and now we have this war going on now between Muslims, who make up about 15% of the population, and the Christians, who make up about 50% of the population of the Central African Republic. And now that war is going on. And they have brought in troops from France and some troops, as a matter of fact, from the OU, the organization of the AU, I should say, the African Unity Conference. And hopefully they'll be able to quiet the situation down, because we don't want to see another bloodbath, excuse me, as occurred in Rwanda in 1994, where we had some 800,000 persons that were killed with a matter of 100 days. And they were using low tech, by the way, and 800,000 people lost their lives, which makes it about, 8,000 people a day for 100 days using low tech, machetes and things of that sort. And we certainly don't want to see that going on in the landscape at the present time. Anyway, I was in Africa for 3 weeks, and during the time that I was there, Mandela died, and I went around to 3 different countries trying to get a sense of what was the feeling about Mandela in other parts of Africa. And when I was in the Cameroons, I asked some of the people I knew there from another trip that I had taken to the Cameroons when I went there last year and stayed there 4 days in the Cameroons. I was asking people both there and in Senegal and Gambia, just people on the street, asking them what did they think about Mandela and what African leaders they have on the African landscape today that they were compared to Mandela. And I was getting responses that took me back in the time where no one that I talked to gave a comparison with Mandela with any of the present-day leaders. And that tells me a lot about the present state of affairs in Africa, because they didn't think anyone had the stature to stand up next to Mandela in the present time period. When I was asking that question, I was getting answers like, well, I would compare him to Kwame Nkrumah. And that was interesting to me, because if they weren't mentioning Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana, then I was getting names like Kenneth Kaunda, who was the first post-colonial leader of what was called Northern Rhodesia, later on becoming the country now known as Zambia. And there was some comparison with Kenneth Kaunda, or maybe Sekou Touré, whose name came up on a regular basis, of Guinea. Jomo Kenyatta's name came up a couple of times. The president called the MZ in Kenya. No one was mentioning the present leaders like Museveni in Uganda, or Yahya Jammeh, who is the president of Gambia. None of those present leaders were in fact mentioned. And I think that shows us something about the legacy of Mandela that's not being talked about, and that is that Mandela is really the last of the Mohegans, in the sense that he's the last of the persons that were involved in fighting the colonial presence. And although the people in South Africa are South Africans, they're not coming in from the outside and being outsiders running the nations in which they were over. They were actually residents of the nations in South Africa's case. And Mandela is the last of those indigenous leaders who took over power after the colonial presence was in fact pushed to the side, and then the majority of the population took over. And I think that's why his legacy will be remembered as the last of those persons in the long line of those African leaders, such as Nkrumah, such as Kaunda, such as Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, who took over power in the East African country that's over there in the area of Uganda and Kenya. And when he took over, Julius Nyerere we're talking about when he took over, I think Mandela fits into that landscape. And because he's the last of those leaders into whose hands power fell once the colonial leaders had vacated the centers of power, and blacks, the majority of the population there, took over. I think he resonates because he is the last of that leadership that actually took over the reins of power, in this case in South Africa. I did want to say that I didn't see the kind of mourning in those African states. They did understand the loss of Mandela, and they understood that nobody stands up next to his iconic leadership, this iconic figure that he became. There's no one in Africa that comes to mind when you think about Mandela in the present African landscape. Certainly that does not fit the present leader, Jacob Zuma, who, if you notice when they had the memorial service where President Obama was one of the speakers, and one of my friends in South Africa wrote me and said that Obama stole the show in terms of his the speech that he gave. We have to look at what happened when Jacob Zuma was announced, and every time they put his picture up there on the screen, Jacob Zuma, who came to the podium and spoke, every time that they showed his image or he got up there in the microphone, Jacob Zuma was in fact booed. And that tells us something about the way his leadership is being seen after being elected to a second term as president of South Africa. And I don't think Zuma is popular because of the corruption of his administration. So all is not well just because Mandela stood up and became president of South Africa. I think you have to look at what is happening right now. And there are some real troubles ahead if South Africa continues on the course that is on right now, because there's a lot of corruption in the Jacob Zuma government. But there is one thing that South Africa has gone for it, and that is that Mandela set the tone for how power will be carried forward in South Africa by leadership, which in many of the African countries has lost sight of limiting its own power, the powers of its leadership, and standing down after a period of time, letting somebody else come in and take over and run the affairs of state after they've done the best they can do. But Mandela did one thing that will play out in a very positive way in South Africa, and that is he did stand down from power after serving one term, and that is to be commended, because you don't see it often in Africa. And when I was in Gambia, one example of that is that we've had two leaders that have run Gambia since their independence, and Jammeh, who is now the present leader, who ran a coup in Gambia in 1994. And it's interesting in the undertone, when you get in these cabs and you're riding around and you're only one in a taxi, you get these conversations that go on that you won't get if they are talking more in front of the population of the country. But when you're in those taxis and you're riding around with the taxi drivers and you're getting some feel about how they really feel about the leadership, you get these little undertones, these undercurrents that show you that they're really upset about what is happening in these countries where these leaders have not yet understood that the fight against colonialism was getting rid of the leadership that was not representative of the democratic values of the countries. And now that they've taken over, they don't want to leave the centers of power. And I was getting these conversations where I guess I can say that without getting anybody in trouble, where the Madika, which is the majority population in Gambia, for example, the undercurrents is that they are trumping at the bits of the fact that Jammeh, who is a Jola, which is the fourth largest group in Guinea, they were upset by the fact that here is a person who's in, not only is he not part of the second largest group in Gambia, not the third largest group in Gambia, they would say he's in the fourth largest group in Gambia, yet he runs it. And the Madika, which is the largest group, those guys are being pushed to the side, and they don't have any power to run the heads of state, and they're really seething under the surface about how since 1994 they had a coup where the Madika was thrown out of power, and now they have Jammeh running the affairs. I can say that because I don't intend to go back there anytime soon. I'll be in Africa next year, but I won't be in Gambia. Gambia, which is the place where Alex Hilliard said that his ancestors, Kunta Kinte, originally came from, and his ancestors he traced back to that particular village, the Jufure village in Gambia. He says that's where Kunta Kinte's homeland was from. And I went to that village, and I didn't see anything even remotely resembling what Alex Hilliard described in that book. As you know, the book called Roots, it came out in 1976. I haven't seen it. When I went there, I didn't see anything that even resembled anything that remotely looked like what Alex Hilliard was describing in this book, which is basically a fictional account, and much of it is pure nonsense. But you have to go there and see it for yourself. But I was in Gambia. I don't think I'll be going back there anytime soon. I'm planning on being in the southern part of Africa in the future. John, I can hardly hear what you're saying. You had a comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, I was going to say, what kind of surprises me is, like, I get both,
Let me see if I can turn the microphone up just a little bit.
Okay. Can you hear me there? All right. Can you hear me?
We're still not getting you as clearly. I don't think you're coming through as far as the viewers are concerned.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We're getting a sound problem.
Yeah. I don't know what's going on then, yeah.
We have a problem with the sound here. I don't know if it's this mic, or maybe you're coming through on the feed outside as far as the viewers
the
are
soundboard
concerned.
showing up.
I can't hear you in here, though, in the studio.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Barely. Go ahead and comment.
What I always think is kind of surprising, though, is that so many conservatives attacked Mandela because he had communist leanings. Yeah, see if you can try another one. Yeah, I might be doing better. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's better now.
Yeah, all right. Just trace that cord there. Sometimes the headphones, they're getting old and they die on us. But so many conservatives are attacking Mandela for his communist leanings. Well, I mean, I'm not a communist, and I think it's a dead end. But I can't blame Mandela if he had actually reached out to the communist world at that point before apartheid ended, because let's face it, they were more sympathetic than, say, the mainstream of other countries, the mainstream governors and stuff. So I can't really criticize for that. I don't create a saint out of him, because I think some people are gonna. Some people just got this glowing. He had such forgiveness. Well, he also allowed attacking of his opponents.
Yes.
Violent opposition. So he wasn't this great saintly figure.
That's right.
I think people are
and there are different stages of Mandela's life, as you know. Mandela goes through a number of stages in his life. When he was imprisoned for the first time for the 27 years we all know he was in prison from 64 to 1990, when he was let out of prison by F.W. de Klerk's government. Basically, while negotiations had been going on behind the scenes, and they had a pretty good understanding that Mandela would come out not as the revolutionary that he had gone in prison as being in 1964. And there were certain things that were in place at this time that would have caused Mandela not to be able to go back to his more radical roots. Don't forget that there was international outcry about his continued incarceration, and some of that had a selling effect, a controlling effect upon Mandela when he came out. But don't forget, he also came out at the age of 72. When Mandela went into prison in 1964, some of that was because of another organization called the PAC. Mandela was a member of the ANC, the African National Congress, but he was pushed a little bit more toward a militant front by the more nationalist organization called the Pan-African Congress, the PAC, which was headed by a former friend of Mandela's, a guy by the name of Robert Sobukwe. And you recall in 1959, Sobukwe had actually suborned the leadership of the ANC by preempting a call for a demonstration in Sharpeville it really was 1960, where they were going to have a demonstration in front of the police department in Sharpeville. The ANC, the group that was headed by Mandela, was going to call that particular demonstration on March the 30th of 1960. And what Sobukwe did of the PAC was preempt that by calling for a demonstration 9 days earlier, because they didn't think that the ANC with more moderate policies could pull it off. And so they were the ones who led the demonstration and called for it. And they were pushing Mandela and the ANC to a more militant front. And I'll come back to that because I want to make a parallel between that and what was going on here in the United States in terms of the end of the NAACP, which was a very moderate organization, and the SCLC, which was headed by Martin Luther King, and how they were in fact pushed into a more militant front by Malcolm X and the Black Muslim organization that was headed by Elijah Muhammad, who was over what is called the Nation of Islam here in the United States. There are a lot of parallels between what was going on here in the Civil Rights Movement and what was going on there in terms of the anti-colonial movement that was taking place in South Africa. But in Sharpeville, when that rally was in fact called, and it was a peaceful demonstration to a large extent, it did turn into a rock throwing kind of thing after things got out of hand. But it was a peaceful demonstration to start out with. But in the aftermath of that demonstration, 69 people lay dead. And now the question comes up, and don't forget this is 1960, what does Mandela and the ANC do, given the posturing that was going on by the PAC, which had taken a more militant edge? Does the ANC ride off into the sunset pretty much because of their political obsolescence, or do they in fact become more militant and stand up to the fact that 69 people had died, and maybe the nonviolent tactics that were in fact employed were not working and probably could not work in this climate of violence by the South African government? I mean, in South Africa, they had their own Bull Connor, so to speak. You know, Bull Connor in Birmingham that had set the fire hoses and dogs on children that were peacefully demonstrating in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, and that which was set the tone for the March on Washington later on that summer, where Dr. King would give his I Have a Dream speech. Well, in South Africa, he had some of the similar things playing out over there as well. And in it playing out, it began to play out in a way in which the emphasis was now upon meeting force with force and meeting violence with violence, which necessitated picking up the gun. And this is what the PAC was advocating. And then, to an extent, the ANC, in which Mandela was a premium member, that was also what they began to advocate as well. Things are now tumbling out of control. And Mandela, who had gone in disguise and was going from one part of South Africa to another, speaking and rallying people to the cause, was eventually captured. And in 1964 was in fact put in jail as a terrorist. By the way, on a list that did not, Mandela's name was not taken off the list of terrorism until 2008, which is just 5 years ago. And he had, in fact, had been president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999, but had never been taken off the terrorist list. Maybe it's an oversight. He certainly wasn't a terrorist when he came out, but maybe an oversight in terms of not taking his name off the list. But he was on the terrorist list until 5 years before his death, because Mandela had been notably and notoriously known as one of the persons that was in fact advocating violence. Well, in fact, in 1985, 5 years before Mandela was in fact allowed out of the prison, de Klerk was going to Mandela and was saying that if Mandela would repudiate and renounce violence, he would let Mandela out of prison. At that point, 5 years, he could have been let out many years earlier, certainly 5 years earlier, if he had renounced violence. And his position was that he would not, and really he could not, from being inside of the prison, renounce violence, because he would have lost his position as the martyr, the living martyr of the movement. By being incarcerated in jail, he was a rallying point for the struggle in South Africa to have a fundamental, are you listening, Mr. President, transformation of South Africa, which had nothing to do with overhauling the country's stated values, but really making it more complete in terms of bringing democracy to South Africa, where you would have a majoritarian type of leadership based upon the population in total. In fact, in 1955. In 1955, at a convention, the ANC had taken the position that South Africa should be for all South African people. That would be both whites, blacks, Indians, other groups that were there, some Pakistanis, so on and so forth. It would be for all of the ones that were in South Africa. That was the platform which they ran. And I think that is what really caused the split between the ANC and the PAC that was formed in 1959, that split with Mandela, because Mandela was calling for inclusive South Africa. And any of the militancy you see thereafter would have come because of the split that was going on, and Mandela being pushed into a more leftist approach, some of them calling him a communist and so on. And I think that is a label that Mandela has to wear based upon that particular time period in his development as a leader in the South African struggle. I would say this also, we're talking about parallels between that struggle in South Africa and that of the United States. We have to go back and look at Dr. King, who was put in prison, in jail, in Albany, Georgia. And we need to go and look at that, because there's a parallel between Dr. King in jail in Albany, Georgia, and Mandela in prison in 1964 and would stay there until 1990, and how being in jail, that becomes a rallying point for those outside the jail. Really Mandela is not really part of the struggle as such. The struggle is going on outside while he's in prison. He's a symbol of that struggle. And as long as he's in prison, that's the symbol that he represented would be one in which he could in fact be the symbol of what they were doing on the outside as they were continuing to act as a battering ram against the apartheid system. We're going to dismantle apartheid, and the symbol of that struggle to bring that about was Mandela being in the prison, locked up behind those walls. Well, they saw that effect that King was having in Albany, Georgia. Lori Pritchard, who was the police commissioner in Albany, Georgia, understood that as long as Martin Luther King is in jail, they cannot stop those demonstrations in Albany, Georgia from taking place. But if they got King out of the jail, and maybe if he would leave, the movement could be broken. And in Albany, Georgia, Lori Pritchard and some of the others got together and paid King's bail, which King didn't want to come out of prison, but they said, "Yo, your bail's been paid, and you can't stay in prison. You got to come out of that jail cell, and because your bail's been paid, and we can no longer keep you incarcerated." And when King came out of the jail, the movement collapsed. Albany, Georgia's civil rights movement, the movement took a gigantic defeat. And really, if the truth is told, the civil rights movement at that point, this is 1962, the civil rights movement at that point was moribund. And they needed something else that would energize it in order to get it back on track so that it could do its job, which culminated in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. To be honest with you, Albany, Georgia had almost killed that movement because of the fact that Lori Pritchard had outflanked Dr. King in Albany, Georgia by simply getting him out of jail. Well, Mandela was in jail and stayed there 27 years, and for the number of years he was there, that movement was not going anywhere because Mandela was a rallying point for it. Well, Mandela comes out of prison in 1990. And we need to look and see what happened as a result of that. And I want to take you back to 1990 when Mandela came to the United States. And if you recall, when he was on Nightline, at the time that he was doing the interview on that program, another person from South Africa called him up on the phone while he was doing the live program on, I think he came on at 11:30 at night. And from South Africa, Gasha Buthelezi called him. And Gasha Buthelezi was the head of the largest ethnic group in South Africa, which is not the members of the ANC's organization. They're basically Hausa. But the largest ethnic group there is the Zulu, which had become a force in South Africa under the leadership of Shaka. You probably remember the film made on him. Shaka was born, and don't tell me who was born in 1786 and died in 1828. Check those dates out and see if those dates are not correct. I think you'll find that those dates are... John, you can check those dates and see if they're correct. I'm saying Shaka was born in 1786 and died in 1828. Take a shot at that. And built the Zulus into a national force. And they, because they incorporated others, when they would defeat these other groups around them, they would incorporate them into the Zulu nation. And they are now the largest ethnic group in South Africa. So here you had, when Mandela came out, because he had become the symbol of the struggle in South Africa, when he came out of prison, the power then fell in the hands, or was getting ready to fall into the hands of the ANC or the Hausa. So Garsha Buthelezi calls Mandela when he's on Nightline. Did you check it, John?
Yeah, here's it. Was a Wikipedia, so give it what it is. But
okay, what did they say?
1787 to 1826, so roughly...
1826?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we would be off by 1 year. Some say
18.
Some say 1887, which would be the same year of the Constitution being drafted before it was ratified later on, 2 years later. But they'll say 1787 or 1786, and then they say 1826 was the date in which he died. Okay, we are 2 years off there.
Another thing is, like, see, what I heard too back in the 80s when that was going on, the apartheid, the movement to end apartheid, that the Zulus actually were probably, weren't they more connected to the white government of South Africa too, the Zulus, because they had like a vested interest being, keeping status quo essentially. That's what
the Zulus they want to hold on to the traditions of the Zulu nation. In fact, when you speak to the Zulu, you will speak to them in their own language. You're not going to talk to them in Hausa. And you're not going to talk to them in English. You're going to talk to them in the Zulu language. And that's how much they are holding on to that history that has to do with Shaka and Setiwayo and some of the others that made the Zulu nation such a powerful group in the South African state. But Garsha Buthelezi, when Mandela was being interviewed, called him on the phone during that interview, and he said, "My brother," speaking to Mandela, he said, "My brother, since you've been out, I've been calling and calling." And he was telling Mandela that you never return my phone calls. And what Mandela said to him in return is very interesting. And it gives you some sense of the politics having now changed because Mandela was no longer in prison. While he was in prison, both the Zulus and the Hausa and all other groups were united because of the symbolism behind Mandela's incarceration. And he's a rallying point for all of what they were all trying to do and accomplish, which was to get the minority group to relinquish power in South Africa. But when Mandela told Buthelezi in that conversation was, first of all, he chastised him for having talked about their differences while Mandela was on foreign soil. And Mandela said that you would, in fact, raise this issue of our division while I'm on foreign soil. And Mandela said, but you know that the issue is no longer simple. And then Mandela said this, which is quite interesting, and I think we need to explain what Mandela was saying in this comment which he made, when he said that you know that the issue is no longer simple. And Mandela said, more interestingly, he said, I am a disciplined member of the ANC. And that needs a lot of interrogation about what Mandela was talking about, because what Mandela was saying was that when he was in prison, it was one thing for all of the people on the outside to rally around Mandela, But when Mandela came out as a member of the ANC. And as a member of the ANC, came out as a person who was a part of the Hausa ethnic group in South Africa. And calling Buthelezi or making agreement with Buthelezi would cross ethnic lines and would have created problems in the ANC and with the Hausa group, which was the basis of Mandela becoming the person he was later on to become president of South Africa. He was saying that the situation that was simple when he was locked up in prison was no longer simple, that things had become very complex. And if you want to see a parallel with that, with what Mandela was talking about, go and look at what happened to Ghandi, who, by the way, was in South Africa for 21 years before Ghandi began to realize that the problems that the Indians were having in South Africa could not be resolved in South Africa. The basis of the Indians' problems in South Africa was in India. That until India was in fact strong, then the problems that the Indians were having in South Africa could not be resolved. And that's why he went back after 21 years of being in South Africa, went back to India and began to fight for the independence of India. Now, going back to India, having been in South Africa for a period of time, Ghandi had picked up a pan-Indian view as opposed to the pan-African view of the Indian struggle. And having represented the wealthy Indians in South Africa, which were the Muslims, and the laboring class of the Indians in South Africa, which was another element of the Indian population, representing both of them, Ghandi saw India as one whole because of his outside struggles in South Africa. But look at what happened to Ghandi when he went back to India and they're fighting against the British being removed from Indian soil, which occurred, if my memory serves me right, August the 15th, 1947. I think I'm right in that date there. And when India got its independence, I know it was in 47, but I think it was August the 15th, 1947. John always checks behind me because we won't be exactly right here. When he got the independence of India, as long as they were all rallying behind getting the British off of the land and getting them and taking power back from the British, everything was pretty much united behind that effort, and the Hindus and the Muslims were united. And Gandhi's pan-Indian idea, they say all Indians under one umbrella with one people and so on and so forth, that could be seemingly realized as long as the struggle was going on. But what happens when the fait accompli, when the mission has been quote unquote accomplished, and the British no longer on the land space? What happens then? And you saw what happened in India. If you saw the movie, for example, starring Ben Kingsley, if you saw that movie, you saw what happened there. You don't have to go and read the book about it. Just go watch the movie and see it. That after the British had been removed from the soil, then civil war broke out in India between the Hindus and the Muslims. And Ghandi, who did not want to see the nation split apart and wanted to have one India, took to his bed and began to fast unto death. Now, the Indian nation is now challenged. Do they want to be the ones who would be the ones that would kill the father of the nation, Mandela being the father of the nation of South Africa in his new image in the post-apartheid period? India is now headed by Ghandi in the post-colonial period. John, did you check that date?
Yeah, it's August 15th, 1947.
Okay.
Yep.
You said I got one right here. I said that Shaka was born in 1828. There are some dates, by the way. That's the date that J. Rogers would give, 1820.
He died in 1826 and born in 1787.
Yeah, that's right. I said 1786 he was born.
Because we got a lot of critics out there, so we want to make sure we get that
straight. J. Rogers would say 1786. And when I was when I was in a seminar in Michigan State for 4 weeks. I gave that date, and the other date they gave was 1787, so I'm aware of that date as well. And 1826, and of course 1828. Some J. Rogers say 1828. So I do have a document that would say just the opposite of that, but I'm willing to accept the change in the dates. But August 15th, 1947 is accurate. John just checked it in terms of the date in which India got its independence. And when that occurred, you see the civil war that broke out between the Hindus and the Muslims. And given the fact that they had broken out, here was the father of the nation, just as Mandela is the father of the South African state, having been the one that was the custodian of South African aftermath of apartheid coming to a close really in 1994. I don't think you could say it ended before that, because it ends with the election of Mandela, although there was some movement toward the finality of that result before that occurred. But I think you have to say that when Mandela was elected, that was really the last nail in the coffin of apartheid in South Africa. And India's situation that parallels what was going on in South Africa was that the split that was sealed and covered up by the struggle, those wounds that were festering there but not really noticeable until there was this accomplished mission. You saw that after that was over, you saw the split between the Hindus and the Muslims coming to the surface again. And Ghandi was going to fast until the war was ended between these two groups. And all the attention was focused on that bed where Ghandi lay there dying. And the question was, do either of these two groups, either of these two factions, want to be the ones that cause the death of the father of the nation? And some of them went there and threw bread on Gandhi's bed and said, "Eat." And Gandhi would say, "I will not eat until the war, the fighting, the killing stops." And all the focus on that bed was such that Ghandi was able to stop with his moral force, with the fact that he was the moral leader of his nation, to stop that particular war from taking place. But he had some other work to do, and that was what cost Ghandi his life. Because what Ghandi thought to do then, given the fact that the Muslims did not want to live under a Hindu majority, because they felt that the majority would in fact keep them from practicing their own religion, Ghandi decided therefore to be beholden to the Muslim, to put at rest that would happen and want to put power in the hands of the Muslims, which that caused problems with the Hindu population, which is the majority population. And so when Ghandi did that, in fact on his road to make peace with the Muslims, while he was traveling to do that, Ghandi was assassinated in 1948 by a person by the name of Godse, who assassinated Ghandi, shot Ghandi 3 times, as a matter of fact, and ended Gandhi's life. You have to be very careful when you're dealing with these different religious factions, and you see all kinds of parallels in other parts of the world, including the United States, because I think that's what really caused Malcolm X's death, in terms of his getting in between some of the forces between him as a member of the Nation of Islam, who was later on expelled from the Nation of Islam, the Muslim organization here, headed by Elijah Muhammad. I think that's what got Malcolm killed, that some of those forces, those religious forces, where Malcolm didn't quite understand, well, I think he did understand the danger, but he wasn't able to maybe manipulate the environment in a way in which he could in fact calm those waters down, and those forces that were in place that were protecting the religious claims made by Elijah Muhammad. I think that's what caused Malcolm's death. A lot of things you can say about it, and extended into a lot of different areas in terms of what went on there. But I think that that's something that we could look at in terms of what happened in the United States to understand what was going on in India. But when Ghandi was trying to sabotage the unity of the nation, which later on they're going to carve Pakistan out of that land. There was no Pakistan prior to that, but Pakistan being carved out of India in the aftermath of the independence of India from the British. That was because the Muslims were not going to be a part of a state where they were overwhelmed by the Hindu majority. And Ghandi was now gone, so what was the glue that was going to keep it together otherwise? And so you had the split that occurred there. And in South Africa, the parallel would be that in the aftermath of Mandela, who stood down from power in 1999, and I really think that's really Mandela's legacy, quite frankly, in South Africa. They can say all these other things they said about him in terms of his forgiveness, as if Mandela is going to come out of prison at the age of 72 and come out and become a person calling for guerrilla warfare or calling for retaliation, which that was almost an impossibility given the fact that there was this worldwide glare upon Mandela, because look at what they had done to bring about his release. And there's no way in the world Mandela could have paid back the world by coming out and then picking up the gun and causing restitution. That's not, and plus another thing that nobody's talking about is that Mandela was aware of what had happened next door in Zimbabwe, where they have this madman that is in power right there named Robert Mugabe, whom I got into a shouting contest in South Africa in 2007 when I was in South Africa, and I was in a seminar, and I was confronting this one guy that's a minister there, the one that's over the reconstitution of land in South Africa, Gwanya. What's his first name? Gwanya is his last name, and he's put over the reconstitution of land. And what I was trying to tell Gwanya was that I would hope that South Africa will not make the same mistake as they made in Zimbabwe, where they threw the whites off the land and gave it to those who were not able to produce anything on the land because they didn't have any farming experience. And there they are redistributing the wealth, redistributing the land in this case. I hope Obama's listening. And the people that they were redistributing it to weren't able to, in fact, make the land productive. And so therefore, the wealth that Zimbabwe had been prior to that is now squalor. And look at what is done now with the currency, where you have to take a $1 billion currency to buy a loaf of bread. The currency has been so inflated there because of Mugabe's misleadership since 1980. Mandela was aware of that and didn't want to repeat that in South Africa. That's why he did not want, that's another reason why he didn't want to go in here and begin to overturn the apple cart in terms of retribution, because he understood what they would lead to. The whites were the ones that had the skills in South Africa. And you have to walk very tepidly in terms of the transformation that you're bringing about. It has to go in terms of steps, qualitative steps, so that you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And having Zimbabwe as a model, that was another thing that kind of stayed Mandela's hand. And I want you to go and look at, there's a book out called, the book is written by Charles Adams. And the name of it is, let me see if I can think of the name of the book. In the course of these events. And Charles Adams wrote, it's a brilliant book. And one of the things that he talks about in that book, among other things, is what happened in the aftermath of the revolution in Haiti. I mean, look at Haiti today. But go back and look at what happened in the aftermath of that revolution that had been undertaken by the militants. It wasn't Toussaint Louverture that started it out. It was three people, John Francois, Bogman, and Bielso. And Toussaint Louverture we'll get into it later on, the more moderate voice, but these more militant voices, which was Dessalines, John Francois, and Bielso and Bogman. Those persons were carrying out in the aftermath of that revolution retribution. And to be honest with you, those whites in Haiti were in fact slaughtered. Then nobody's written about that. I read the book by C.L.R. James called The Black Jacobins, and he never mentioned it. And in that classic book that he wrote in 1939, it's a classic book written by the Trinidadian historian C.L.R. James. But if you read Adams's book, in the course of human events, that's the name of the book, in the course of human events, you go and read that book and look at those people being strung up in Haiti, and then look at why Haiti is so poor today. And I don't think you can claim that it has nothing to do with what occurred in the aftermath of the revolution. See, once you win, you have not yet won yet, because the next phase of the battle is to transcend into power, making use of that which is already in place that serves the interests of the new South African state. And to be honest with you, let's be honest about South Africa. When I was in Africa when I was in Africa in 2010, I noticed I was on the continent when they had the World Cup, and they're going to have it again. And as you've been reading about, in 2014, they're going to have the World Cup this time in the Western Hemisphere. It's going to be in Brazil. And we'll see what Brazil does, because Pele's the great Pele, who brought 6 titles to Brazil, 6 championships to Brazil, not World Cup championships, but championships overall to Brazil. We're going to see what his son does in that particular event. But in 2010, it was held in South Africa. And I can tell you that no other state in South Africa could have held the World Cup, because they would not have had the ability to facilitate it, because we would not have had the infrastructure to accommodate the World Cup with all the people that are there from all over the world in that particular state. Only South Africa, the single nation out of the 54 countries in of the 54 countries in Africa, South Africa was the only one that could have put that particular event on the African continent. And we need to keep that in mind as we talk about apartheid, because under the apartheid cloak, there was development going on, and we have to be able to see that in order to see the forests and the trees, and not just see it as something that in fact devastated South Africa without giving anything back in return. And Mandela did not want to undo that which had been put in place by the leadership in South Africa, and then undo that by moving too fast to make the transition in all ways, in terms of taking away from those who had accumulated under the apartheid regime, and then just giving it without any thought about what the consequence would be to those who were absent from that power center. He did not make that mistake, and that's one of the reasons why he did not do it. He had examples that he could actually go back and look at where others had taken another course to their detriment. And I can tell you that given the fact that other parts of Africa made that mistake, not necessarily with the retribution aspect, but in terms of not understanding what it took in order to bring about greater development of Africa, of African countries. We have a poverty in Africa that is unparalleled. I mean, you can't even believe some of the things I ran into in the Cameroon and in Senegal, and even more so in Gambia. I mean, more so in Gambia than it was in the others. But I saw poverty that you would not believe while I was in those 3 countries, because of a lot of reasons. But one of them is that the leadership did not understand that you have to have an entrepreneurial class that is moving and shaking the country so that development can take place. And it's not colonialism that explains why Africa is in the shape that it's in. It's the absence of that entrepreneurial class that you must have in order to have the kind of wealth creation that we see that was the foundation of the greatness of this country. The class, by the way, that we're now attacking, and which explains why this country is now going downhill, because of the chains we're putting upon that class in this country right now, and we're going to see that the consequences of that in the United States. We already begin to see it in terms of how this is playing out on the landscape of this country. But if, in the absence of that class, or because that class is not even allowed to exist, we see the consequences of it in all of the 54 countries in Africa, including now South Africa, in terms of what is happening because of that class not being able to do the things that will cause the wealth creation in those countries. And until that is in fact addressed, we can claim colonialism caused it, but until that is addressed, then wealth creation is an impossibility. And it's not going to come from the political leadership in those countries, certainly not from people like Jammeh in Gambia, because I don't see any evidence of any development taking place on any level that is there. And if you notice that there are no products coming out of Africa, the black Africa, that we can say was produced there. There might be some things like, what's that one fruit that we see on these shelves, and I saw it on all the trees when I was in Africa. What's that fruit called? Anyway, they may export some of those fruits that are produced on the farms there. But in terms of making products that export to other parts of the world, you don't see any products coming out of Africa that are exported to other parts of the world. And if they don't import rice in every country where I was, in fact, what I noticed when I was in Africa was that rice was, everyone is trying to buy a bag of rice. And that's like the staple. If they don't import rice from Asia, I think some of it is imported from the United States. If they don't do that, then there's going to be a problem with people eating. And bread is very big over there. The breakfast is like bread and tea in those countries, a staple there. So the development that Mandela saw not taking place in Zimbabwe and some of the other countries that inherited leadership once it got in the colonial presence out of the country, he saw what happened in the aftermath of that and did not want to have that duplicated in South Africa. And to his credit, he did two things. One was not to take retribution against the group that had been in power, and he had set up apartheid, which only goes back to 1948 in South Africa. You didn't have apartheid before that, but apartheid is put in place because the business community was not going to be buying this idea that they ought to be discriminated against black workers. They're going to go to the workers that will work at a rate where they can in fact make a profit. Then they didn't care whether you were black or white, and they had to put apartheid in place in order to maintain the hierarchy of white leadership, because the business community was going to liberate that leadership by in fact giving the jobs to those who work at a rate where the profit motive could be carried out. In other words, capitalism was going to remove that from power. Remove the whites from power without there being any kind of upheaval. The business community is going to bring it about. And they saw the end result of that, and they put apartheid in place in South Africa in 1948. So don't think that the country was saturated with so much racism that that they couldn't see black folks being in power at some point down the line. That's not true. And it's not even true in the South of the United States. You can talk about Bull Connor and all of those people down south. But the fact of the matter is that the political class in the South, I'm talking about Bull Connor and George Wallace and Ross Barnett and Laurie Pritchett and Faubus over there in Arkansas and other governors, Barnett in Mississippi, those persons were the ones that was driving that engine. And this idea that the culture is racist and all these things, I see that to be a false premise. And really, that's really why we have people like, I was writing about this on my Facebook wall, people like Aisha Harris writing about we need to get rid of a white Santa Claus, which tells you that we have there's so little to complain about right now in the American landscape as far as race is concerned, that we're now going and creating issues to deal with because the problem has been resolved. I want to give a shout out to Mandela, not because he was perfect, but because Mandela was one of the persons that has put the final nail in racial politics throughout the world, and we now have that lid closed, and we can now have healing going on there, and hopefully he'll be an image we can begin to use for healing that goes on elsewhere as well. Okay, Mandela, you did what you had to do, and you did it well, and want to commend those person carrying out his legacy. Until next week, and we're glad to be back here at flinttalkradio.com. Until next week, want you to follow your dream. And don't ever forget that if you don't follow your dream, you will never know what's on the other side of the rainbow. Until next week, we'll see you then.